I am delighted to be doing introductions for this presentation. Today, we are welcoming the third speaker in a series called New Perspectives on Women and the Historic Circus. And this series was conceived of as a chance to showcase some of the amazing scholars who are coming through the archives here at the Ringling, using our resources as well as many other circus collections to do their own research into a variety of topics related to circus. This time around, we are focusing on stories that relate directly to women in the circus because we have been part of an NEA grant that is celebrating that topic. Today's speaker is someone who I had the pleasure of meeting early in 2020, which just is boggling to me. Probably one of the last new people I got to meet in person. And she had come to the archives to research into the materials, but also to be here in the Sarasota community and to speak with members of the circus community here. So I am here to welcome Jenny Leigh Du Puis. She is a doctoral student at Cornell University. She's studying in their fiber science and apparel design program. But she entered that program after 10 years working in the industry of performing arts with circus and theater. She worked with Cirque du Soleil, she worked with Circus Smirkus and other companies. And so she had a front row seat, as it were, for wardrobe and what it meant to performing bodies. So in her research now, she's looking at safety and functional design for costuming for extreme performances, which is really what circus is. And today she's going to share with us some of the work that she's been doing and how it ties to women performers in aerial acts. So Jenny Leigh, welcome. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me today. And I'd also like to thank those who have come to attend. I know that we have a variety of backgrounds and experiences in the audience, everything from former circus performers to fashion historians. So the way that I have tailored this presentation is that it's 3 mini presentations in one. And I'll be trying to touch on as many points as possible, but it is a very long time period to cram into about 40 minutes. So bear with me if we just kind of scratch at the surface of a couple of things. Before I start the presentation, just for a little bit of orientation, I use the term female aerial circus costume in my descriptor, and that is intended for female born or female presenting, because there is an honored tradition in circus of those who are born male dressing as female in their performances. And so we have an example in here. And so I wanted to make sure that everyone was included. I'll also be discussing some resources at the very end for circus costume. This is an under-researched area, and it's very important because the safety and function of what people wear when they train and perform circus has to come first. And the aesthetics are very closely tied to that, because if you have a boring looking circus costume, but it's really safe, it's not going to have the same impact on the audience. So you have to marry the two. So diving right in, this first section begins with pieces from the Ringling E-Museum, which I strongly recommend you check out. They go down for maintenance at about midnight every night, which I, as a night owl, have run into a couple of times, so watch out for that. But it's really a wonderful wealth of resources if you haven't been able to check that out. Beginning it with the earliest piece is 1875, and I juxtapose that with a piece from 1885, and I'm sorry if I'm looking a little to the side, it's my second screen. So just looking at the kinds of clothing that people wore when they were performing at this time, we see some very heavily embellished detailing on the front. It's corseted, but yet they're still able to do the movements that they need to do because of the cut of things and just working around the fact that at this time, a corset was a foundational garment. Bras weren't really something that was happening at this point, and so you had to make do with what you had. In 1885, we can see the difference, the shift We have more of a squared off neckline here. We've got some fringe around the edges, and I'd like you to take specific note of the fringe. We'll look at a photo in just a moment. But in particular on these looks, if you see what they're wearing here are shorts over tights with a corset and a kind of boot. And so this was kind of a prevalent silhouette of the time. So thinking more about that fringe, we're hopping out of the Ringling E-Museum because there was one specific woman that I wanted to focus on, and her name is Miss Lala. She was the subject of a series of paintings and studies by Edgar Degas, which you can see here, Miss Lala at the Cirque Fernando, and this is a process sketch. Here we have a photograph from Rutgers University, their collections there, but notice here we have the fringe, a corset underneath, and then we have laced up shoes, and we have these bloomers. So there's consistency across silhouettes here. And with this wonderful photograph, we can get a better, more developed idea of what people were wearing. I loved this image. It's from 1896. This is a poster, and we see full looks. You have a full skirt. I particularly enjoyed the term long skirt evolutions. If you have any kind of aerial experience or experience beyond just existing as a basic human being on the ground like myself, you can imagine that the aerodynamics of wearing a long skirt would have an impact on your movement through space. And so while these are similar to the standard fashions of the times, modifications would have needed to be made so that these performers could do the things that they needed to do with the garments that they were wearing. In 1904, we meet Charmian, and this is a series by Frederick Whitman Glazier, which these are on glass. They're absolutely extraordinary in detail. And Charmian was famous for a striptease that was performed on the trapeze. And there's a really exciting video that you can find on YouTube. Thomas Edison was particularly taken with Charmian and recorded her in performance. And so you can find that. It's a little bit grainy, and for time, I didn't want to put it in this presentation, but get thee over to YouTube and check it out. This is also a really, really wonderful example of people using fashions of the time. It's much more fancy, of course. We see a lot of this really exquisite cut work and lace here. But this is the layering that she's wearing in her striptease. And so this series of images is a really wonderful peek into not only what she would have thought about for her costume process. What could I take off next while on this trapeze, but also into the fashions and layerings of the time. Interestingly, and I can't show the photo because I don't have that specific copyright, but in 2020, Valentino did a haute couture presentation that featured a number of models standing and sitting on aerial apparatus, such as a trapeze. And there is a woman wearing a white feathered fluffy hat, standing on a trapeze, wearing a long white gown, and it is eerily reminiscent of this image. From 1906 to 1919, we see more of the kind of everyday street fashion. Again, long skirts, blouses. This is a really wonderful iron jaw act in full hats and everything. This is a very popular silhouette around the turn of the century. I'd say like 1900 to 1910. We have these ruched bloomers. If they're wearing corsets, you can't really tell because the tops are more blousy. And then we have interesting detail on the arm. And at first I was really intrigued by this interesting detail because I kept seeing it around the year 1900 to 1910. And it looks like, in addition to being a decorative element, it's also been posited by members of the research group that perhaps it is a decorative detail because women who are aerialists have very muscular arms. Perhaps they were trying to disguise this. But it's also a functional thing, which we'll see in just a moment, which I realized just the other day. We also have this very ballerina-esque silhouette. We have the tutu, the nipped-in waist. She's on a sketched-in tight wire with the ballet-style shoe that laces up around the ankle, also very popular around this time, and everyone's still in tights. And here we are again. So this is a really wonderful demonstration of how something can be decorative and functional at the same time. If you think about aerial arts, chances are good that they're going to need to grip something perhaps under their arms or be gripped by another person under their arms. Having fabric right here would provide a little bit of protection for the skin while still giving the aesthetic of what we would today, I think, call a cold shoulder look. The ability to have more range of motion with your shoulder completely open, but still have some protective coverage underneath. I don't think that everyone had this armpit gusset by itself, but this is indicative of the prevailing look of the time. The aesthetic of this is carried through in this particular poster. This was still very popular. We have these wonderful ruched bloomers right here. We still have a corseted nipped in waist and some ruffles and embellishment detail up top. And then we love these sashes on the posters. They just give so much movement. Bird Millman, we can't talk about the evolution of circus costume without talking about Bird Millman. And her look was this, she was kind of this ingenue, this really highly revered tight wire walker. And I'd like to point out the use of the word artiste with an E on the end. And so this is from 1918. Here we have a publicity image by Daguerre, also from the, and these are all from the Tibble Circus collection. I put the attributions up top. And while I did not note it, it is because they are all from the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art archives. And so that's where I found everything. So take a close look at this poster because it's going to look very familiar in 1925. So we've taken the Bird Millman image and juxtaposed on top Berta Beason's face. And now I'll call your attention to the use of the word artist without the E, which gives us our first clue, perhaps. So Berta Beason was also a renowned tight wire walker and was female presenting in their costume look. This is a stage name. They were born under a different name, but this is the name that we know them by. And we're able to get these really rich, wonderful costume details through the photos. You see all of the fur edging over here reflected in the image and the way it would move to the artist. Again, we have those lace-up kind of ballet flats. And while these don't have a date on top, we know that it's probably approximately around the mid-20s. I really loved this image. I hadn't found it before I was putting together this presentation. It's called Scenes of a Female Aerialist. And to me, it's a really great indicator that we have moved away from the corset for sure. We're into the 1920s, maybe the early 1930s. You can tell by the bobbed haircut. So this doesn't have a date attributed to it, but the fashion historians in the audience would clock this immediately. I have a confession to make. I am not a hardcore fashion historian. I can place approximate decades, though I know there are those in the audience who could knock this down to the exact year with accuracy. But here we have her, our little flapper doing the splits on the tight wire. And again, we have the lace-up ballet style slipper. Lillian Leitzel, I picked these three specific images because I thought that they were really nice in conversation with each other. Here we have the promotional poster from 1918. And again, these don't have a date attributed, but because of the silhouette, we can see the connections on the sides here, her pleated skirt. It's sitting a little above the natural waist, not quite empire, but just about there, in this baby doll style dress. And so what I loved about these three together is that we have the promo image, we have her getting into her wardrobe with the help of a friend, and then we have what I believe is post-act, and I'm making this claim purely on the state of her curls. Those of us with curly hair understand that when you move it around a lot, it's just going to keep getting bigger. And so this is purely based on my hunch and the position of where they are standing. That's not proven, so please bear with me on that. But Lillian Leitzel's style evolved over time. She passed away in the early 30s. And for time, I did cut a slide that I had of her later kind of styles, but they evolved more to the ballet look, a little more tutu, really strong, kind of V-neck top. And I was delighted to find this image in the archives. This is the costume of Lillian Leitzel. When you look at these older images, it's common to think, okay, she's in black, she's in white. Not always the case. In here we have this lovely light purple, this violet. Another resource that I'm accessing through my dissertation research is the billboard. And there's this wonderful series of descriptions around this time period called Footlight Fashions, where they would go and talk to the performers, go backstage. And out of this, we get really excellent information about the kinds of colors and embellishments that were used. So around this time period, in addition to white, we also have pale green, pale pink, and here pale purple. So it's safe to say that Lillian Leitzel likes some pastels, also sequins and rhinestones. Excuse me. Another thing I loved about working in the archives was looking at, especially if there are families that perform for multiple generations and you have image captures across the generations, you can track costume change over time within this subset of people. For example, this 1903 look, we're still in corsets. We have the fringes now on the men's costumes. And in place of that, we have tassels, which with an aerial act, you can imagine lots of wonderful movement on the front. And this great Gibson girl kind of hairstyle. But then look at this, in 1928, we have a much more simplified silhouette. Not only is the corset gone, but we've got a hint of a midriff here. This one doesn't have a date, but again, we can track it to about the 1920s, early 30s with the flapper-esque look, the Clara Bow styling of makeup. And I believe in the billboard, I haven't confirmed this totally accurately, but there is a description of the Seeger-Silban troupe, including descriptions of a cockade at the waist, which I believe, if not these specific costumes, it's awfully close. In 1932, we see this image, and again, let's just quickly compare it. My apologies. Let's just quickly compare this elaborate kind of look over to very simple silhouettes. So with the invention of the leotard by Jules Leotard in 1879, thereabouts, the original leotard looks very different from what it does today. Today we have this kind of very specific silhouette in mind, but it was originally called a maillot, which was informed by swimwear at the time. And it was much closer to this kind of leg line, this kind of silhouette, and it has been transformed for both men and women over time. So in this look, it's very fitted to the body. It would have been a knit garment to get this kind of fit, although Lycra had not been invented yet. Knit garments that were fit close to the body have existed for centuries. It's just not something that we generally tend to connect. In the 1940s, so here we are at the end of wartime, Ringling went through a teal phase for their female aerialists, which is evidenced by these images here. These are all from the back lot, which provides some really nice natural lighting to the photos. We have the two-piece looks here all over the place and lots of really rich embellishment, sequin detailing. And instead of sequin detailing here, we have this nice sheen on a fabric. The bikini was invented about 1946, but women in circus have been wearing two-piece garments long before it ever hit the beaches in France. In 1950s, early 50s, I'm focusing on this artist. This is Pinito del Oro. And I wanted to highlight her looks because we have front and back views in color and black and white of her Washington trapeze act. And this image, I think on the archives, it is actually upside down. I couldn't figure out what I was looking at because I thought she was doing a jumping jack, and then I noticed the truck tire in the background. So I flipped it over for this. And if you look closely, you can see she's on the trapeze. She's balanced on top of her head while it's swinging. Again, we have that rich, deep blue color, but we also have the pink phase. And this is also emblematic of, there's a constant pattern of women dressed as butterflies over multiple decades in Ringling. I think that's an interesting topic to study for the future. I just haven't had the time to do that yet. In this, we see stripes of sequins that create a pattern that makes your eye travel. So if you start at the top of the garment, it just kind of swoops your eye down. And in this type of pattern, it would emphasize more of an hourglass silhouette. So it's kind of mimicking the look that you would attain via a corset without needing to wear one visually from afar. And here we see there's probably a center back zipper with maybe a little bit of a lace up right here in terms of being able to don and doff. And included here, 1956, we have more, it's a one piece still, we have striations with sequins still. And this is my last slide of this first section before we move into the next section. And I loved these images together. We have an ad and a sketch. And so in this ad, it's eerily reminiscent, eerie is not the right word, it's interestingly reminiscent of a very famous blonde, Marilyn Monroe, gentlemen prefer blondes, with an opposite colorway. In this, she's in her famous look, I think it's pink satin with the black contrast in the bow. And then she's wearing long hot pink opera gloves. And so here we have the opposite colorway. We have the blonde. She's wearing some nylons and she's in these small slippers instead of the lace up around the ankle. That has evolved out and we're into the super simple ballet flat, which is echoed over here. And we're moving more towards the kind of subtle sensuality of the female aerialist in these one-piece looks. These presentations that I'm doing today are geared towards traditional circus and towards Ringling, in large part because this is for the Ringling Museum, and a lot of the items that I accessed from the archives are from the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. However, it is not the only circus in the world, and it is also not the only circus in the States. And while I am working on developing a research project around the history of circus costume from Cirque du Soleil and the more nouveau cirque or contemporary cirque styles, these presentations today are geared more toward traditional style circus. So Cirque du Soleil was founded in 1984 and really splashed onto the scene with a very different kind of circus aesthetic. I have one slide dedicated to it that we'll see in just a moment. But when you are looking at circus costumes, it's important to remember that circus doesn't just happen in the US and North America. It doesn't just happen in Europe. It's been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years all over the world. And I think that this presentation today, starting the conversation about circus costume history and a research focus, it's important to think about this is just a tiny microcosm and does not speak to the entirety of everything that has happened for hundreds of years with clothing that people have worn. Unitards with cutouts and panels. This is a common theme. So we've got all of these wonderful stretch fabrics. This is 2009 and 2013. This is a Ringling look. And here we have Cirque Eloise. And I think I blew it up just a little bit so that you could see more of the detail. But flesh-toned fabric with cutouts and details either as panels or appliqued on top. This gives the illusion to the audience that there's some mystery, perhaps there are some peaks of flesh. And if it's perhaps a mesh instead of an opaque fabric, you could actually see the muscles move underneath. All of these circus artists make movement look so effortless, but if you have the image and the hint of the musculature underneath the costume, you have a better understanding of how hard these people are actually working to make this beautiful art. I'm calling this specific concept out because it is an easy thing to do. And as a costume designer, it is easy to make this look extraordinary in so many different ways. With the increase in different kinds of fabrics that are accessible to us, you can make a basic unitard into it could be a whole spectrum of looks without adding anything on top. Just a basic unitard can do so many things. So to me, this is a quintessential contemporary kind of base garment. We had the leotard and only the leotard for a long time. And then we had two-piece looks. And that was the trend for a long time. And now we've moved into the adaptation of the unitard. But we're starting to see, because people can access images and fashion is cyclical and it will come back around about every 20 years or so. We're seeing it right now with Y2K fashion coming back with Gen Z. So the cycle of circus costume does come back. We see hints of hearkening back to historical styles. For example, Cirque du Soleil's corteo is historically garmented in addition to sarcana. While those two still are very Cirque du Soleil specific signatures, you can see elements of historical costuming in there. You would not perhaps put a corset on an aerialist using the same fabrics as you would in 1875, but you could build one with stretch panels and allow them to breathe and move a lot better. So speaking of Cirque du Soleil, here's some images that I pulled from Creative Commons. So talking about unitards with cutouts and being able to do a lot with it. We have these gradations in color. You can see that there's a sheen, so it's the fabric has been treated in some way. Textile innovations have really come so far, where people used to need to hand paint all of those rich, beautiful details. Now we have digital printing, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But you can also do things like take your digitally printed fabric and then apply a foiling or a sheen or something to the top of it. There are also interesting experiments happening with 3D printing in the apparel industry in general, where they are 3D printing on top of fabric to start this additive manufacturing kind of detail. Here in the middle, we have I really loved this image because with the silhouette of the neckline and the embellishment on the front, it is similar to that look from 1875, the very first image that we started with. And had I thought I had, I would have put that together on this slide, my apologies. But a really very embellished front, and this silhouette of the neckline is evocative of what we used to do in circus way back when. And so it's a subtle detailing that is carried through to today. And here she is in pants instead of bloomers and tights. Carrying the concept of the unitard forward into what else it can do. This is a unitard which is more of a kind of a bike tard, in that I know that it's shorts underneath because this is the show I used to work on. I was a costume technician for Cirque du Soleil's Ka. I worked there for about 6 years. And this is the twin sister look. So she has this unitard base, but then things added on top. So this skirt can be zipped off and on. We see a hole at the center front for a harness point to be attached. And then there are specific considerations for shoes. While I have mentioned shoes briefly in conversation with the images, that's an entirely separate area of research that could probably take the rest of my life. I wanted to start wrapping up this presentation today with some resources and references, because this is an important area of research and it impacts so many different fields. I think it's important to have all of the resources available to everyone. In academia, a lot you hit a paywall and the general public can't access the information. And so I wanted to make sure that starting this conversation, everything is open, and also tying things in from the apparel industry as well, because I think that apparel and costume are, they Venn diagram, but not totally into a circle. And I think that they could have more potential to overlap in the future, in particular, the technologies that the apparel industry is using. Some circuses are using it, but there's a lot more that can be done. And I think that joining forces would be an important way to move forward. Digital printing. So I touched on it before, but going from hand painting fabric into being able to custom print your own fabrics to what you specifically wanted. This is a very basic introduction and overview to the process. So in and the image I'm using, this is from my master's thesis work where I was looking at traditional techniques with contemporary technologies. So I hand painted this on watercolor paper, took a photo of it, put it into Photoshop, sent it to spoonflower.com, which is a great resource if you want to have some fabric custom printed. And then I was able to create a repeat. So I didn't have to paint this and get it as an exact match on yards and yards of fabric. I could just have someone else print it for me. But say you had a targeted area of the body that you wanted to have printed. So for example, if you are making a full body unitard and you want to mimic the look of abs, say, or musculature, you can do what's called an engineered print. And using this image, again, this is a very basic setup, you could then just print this specific pattern piece. So if you are a pattern maker, this may look familiar. This is a side front leotard piece. We have the armhole here and the leg line. So instead of needing to finagle my pattern piece onto this yardage of fabric and try to match everything up at the same time, I can cut time and cut ink and just print in this specific area. So this is being used by some of the larger companies and some of the smaller companies as technological advancements are being made in the apparel industry and costs are being lowered. Some of the smaller companies are starting to pick this up too. Another technology that's really extraordinary in terms of saving time is the concept of 3D body scanning and virtual prototyping. This is a 3D body scan, and again, these are all from Creative Commons. This is a 3D body scan of a person. And with this, I can get a full set of measurements as long as I know where their landmarks and some basic things like their height. From this, I could take a 3D body scan and put it into a software such as Clo3D, and then make all of my patterns based on this body scan. So those of us who are pattern makers know that if you do it by hand, it can be a very laborious process, especially if you have to make tiny adjustments and then it becomes dominoes and then it just takes a lot of time. If you can do that here, you can cut hours and hours of time. I can see this being of great use in the circus costume industry, and I imagine some of the larger companies, again, are using this technology. But as these software programs become more accessible to those who are not in the larger companies, this may save some costume designers a lot of time. Some recent studies just in 2020. So the study of looking at the circus body in motion is becoming much more popular in, say, the physical therapy world. And these are some of the studies that have recently come out, or like this is, I think this is a popular media article. And to forgive my nerdiness for just a moment, I'm really excited about this as a functional apparel designer who works with wearable technologies in another part of my research. So we can look at results from these studies and really key into how the circus body moves through space, what kind of G-force they attain. We can look at angles, and a few of these studies have demonstrated that aerialist shoulders are 20% more flexible than us mere mortals who, again, don't live a life up in the air. In this particular article, it was a little astonishing to me, and I have a references slide at the very end, so you can take a screenshot of it if you would like to read it. One of the artists wearing this inertial sensor, it registered a G-force of 15, which is kind of phenomenal if we think about space exploration. They originally would feel a G-force of like 8, I think. So just in conversation. And then this was I really liked this. It is in its beginning stages, but this is a team that is developing for aerialists a costume where I think it's a flying trapeze act. And so when you grab, you're each wearing sensors, and when you grab, your costume lights up because you're finishing off a circuit. So wearable technologies like LEDs, those are in use in shows like Cirque du Soleil's Michael Jackson show. And so there is this need to think about these hard technologies that are kind of fragile going onto this body that moves in really extreme dynamic ways that also the costume needs to be washed and maintained. So how do you marry all of those together? This is something wearable technologies really hit the fashion industry as this big splash, and it was a novelty and have kind of fizzled back out. If we remember around 2010 or so, it was kind of popular to make all of your clothing light up. But the capabilities for circus are really extraordinary, and I think that it's worth further study. That's for the future, because I do need to wrap up so we can get to questions. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are not professional circus artists who are taking classes. They're taking community classes. They're doing whatever they can. They just want to learn and have fun with it. And they need clothes that they can train and perform in without perhaps having a huge budget for. If you go to Target and buy a pair of leggings and wear those leggings to your aerial silks class, you might slide right off because the fabric is not conducive, it's too slippery. So as circus costume designers and those who focus on apparel and activewear, we need to look at how can we meet this need? It's such a niche to some people, but yet hundreds of thousands of people are taking these classes. And a lot of it is people streetwear. It's going to your closet, seeing what you have and trying to make it work. And then you get to class. I didn't put the image up today, but I have one image that I've used a number of times from a wonderful aerialist named Nina Gershi. She was kind enough to share an image with me of the leftovers of her shirt after she had done some spins around the trapeze bar, and then her long sleeve cotton knit shirt got wrapped around it and she had to be cut out. So in addition to sacrificing garments from your wardrobe, it's also a safety issue. If you're going to slip off your apparatus, if you're going to get stuck and you need some help getting out, that's a problem. And that's something that we can be better about meeting. Also, streetwear is costume, especially with, and this is something that I'm finding as I'm doing my research with those I would call semi-professionals. So they're going through a training program. They're probably in their mid to late teens, early 20s, and have not yet worked with a costume designer, and they don't know how to sew for themselves. So trying to find costumes for themselves, and as many of us students know, the budget isn't always there. So trying to do what you can with what you've got in your closet as a costume, it needs to go to another level if you're trying to convey an image to your audience that you are not just walking out of your own closet. If that's your look, amazing, go for it and do it. But if you are going for that more upscale or different kind of aesthetic, where you want some sparkle, you want some close fit, it's a little bit more of a challenge. We've touched on the wearable technologies. And again, coming back to that traditional or classic circus influence, it's very popular. If you go on to Google and you just Google circus costume, chances are you're going to get like the Party City kind of circus ringmaster style look. But if you dig a little bit deeper, or if you go to Etsy, it's a popular aesthetic is the vintage circus. We see it in popular media like Greatest Showman or Water for Elephants. And anytime something like that hits popular media, it causes a bump. It might not influence the entire fashion industry, but it at least has a little bit. So this traditional and classic circus influence is still there. Something else that's very, very important to consider is accessibility in design. And we who have worked in wardrobe and those who have performed in these costumes understand perhaps the art of the quick change when you have 30 seconds to go from one full look into another. Where are your fastenings? How quickly can you get into and out of it? That's one form of accessibility. But the accessibility I specifically am thinking of is that disabled bodies also perform circus. And a lot of circus costumes are not appropriate for circus bodies because they do not consider the apparatus and perhaps the mobility aid that's needed. And they also don't consider openings for donning and doffing. So disabled bodies also train and perform circus, and they are equally deserving of training clothes and circus costumes. And there's a company in the UK, Extraordinary Bodies. Their website is amazing. I strongly recommend you go and check it out. But they have some wonderful interviews with their performers where they talk about what they need and what they want and what circus means to them. Some resources for you. You can tell this is my wallpaper behind me. So these are some of my favorite books that I have been going to over the course of my research. If you speak French, these two, top notch. If you don't, there is an article from this that is part of a digital publication that was published out of a costume panel in Ghent that took place January 2020. And I didn't put together a link list, but I can do that and get it to Jennifer if there is need for that. In addition, please go check out the Ringling e-Museum. It has been such an incredible resource in my dissertation research. There are a couple of specific Facebook groups I'd like to shout out: the Circademics and the History of Acrobatic and Gymnastic Performance. They have very different membership numbers, but I think it's a really wonderful resource. If you're an academic and you look at circus, you have to join Circademics. If you're interested in circus history, especially acrobatics, check out the other group. And then I am a new member of the Circus Historical Society within the last few months. I'm delighted to start diving in, and I purposely didn't join until this year because I knew that I was going to need a lot of time to start digging into everything and meeting everyone. In addition to this, I have, as I'm working through my dissertation research, I have some resources that are available and are upcoming. In February, my co-curator, Chi Yamakawa, and I developed this digital exhibition, Flights of Fancy, and I will put the link in the chat so that you can get to it. Publicly accessible 24 hours a day, hosted through Cornell Libraries. And it really is a rabbit warren of links and information. We talk about different topics of circus costume, history, the influence of circus on fashion. There's also a really important text that we put together about the history of cultural appropriation and exploitation in circus, which shows through in costume. And we have some very basic steps in a call to action for circus costume designers moving forward. So I would recommend checking that out. And in addition to that, the serious nature of that specific page, we also talk about the history of the leotard. There's a whole page dedicated to aerialists. We talk about the spec and creating a character through the costume that you're wearing. So if you want to check it out, please do. I am intending to graduate in 2022, and as such am developing a series of exhibitions and programming that will take place in the spring of 2022, kind of coming to a head around World Circus Day, third Saturday in April. So I am launching a new exhibition starting in February that will run through the end of April. Looking at a bit of what I talked about today, I'll have a chronology of circus costume. I'll have a specific focus on the function versus the spectacle, and look at circus influence on fashion, which I wish I had left some of my props up here. And then also the labor behind it. Someone has to design it, someone has to make these, someone has to maintain these costumes. And I think that labor in costume in general is something that is not as acknowledged. I'm very biased with my past professional history as a costume technician and designer. And then I have an ongoing research study where I'm speaking with circus professionals. At this point, I've kind of saturated my performers quota, but I'm still looking to speak with circus costume designers about safety and function. I've spoken with about 70 individuals so far over the last year and a half. Thank you, thank you, thank you. John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art, the archival team, Jennifer Lemmer-Posey for inviting me to do this. I cannot thank you enough, and our group of historical researchers. I'd also like to thank my advisor, Dr. Hee-Ju Park, and committee member, Dr. Denise Green, for supporting my work and entertaining the idea of having a PhD student in circus costume, because I know that that's it can be a little bit out there for some. Here are the references that I was speaking about earlier, and I'll leave this up for a moment if you want to take a screenshot of it. And I can also put together like a Google Doc or something that we can link to with all of these resources that I've discussed today. And here's your warning that I'm leaving this slide in 3, 2, 1, screenshot quick. Okay. Thank you so much. I would love to take any and all of your questions, and I've left my email up on this slide so that you can reach out if you have anything beyond the scope of today. Thank you.
Jenny Leigh, thank you so much. That was amazing. You covered so much history in such a short window of time. Good job. I want to open up to other people's questions because I get to talk to you on my own. But I do, before I move to that, I want to comment. It resonated with me yet again, and as I've said in other presentations in this series, your ability to read images, right? To spend time, to slow down with a poster or a photograph and see the details that your eye specifically can call out is such a gift. You do it so well. And I will not look at photos in this collection the same because of so many of you, but now I'm going to be looking at tassel lines and where things are moving, and it will add a whole new level for me in interpreting images. So thank you. I really am thrilled that you joined us today. As I mentioned, I don't want to take any more time. Technically, we wrap up around 11:30, but we can run a little long, I think. If anybody has any questions, Laura, I think we probably are safe to go now back to regular view, or I guess Jenny Leigh, if you want to stop sharing.
Yeah, if you want to do that, we can do that. And I've got some questions in the chat. One that kind of relates to what you were saying, Jennifer. Dave is asking, how are posters or the posed photographs distinguished from actual performance? So for instance, did women actually wear heels while performing, or was that something that they were just posing for? And sort of making the distinction between the reality and what we see in the publicity images.
I think that that's a great question. And if we don't have videos of the images, it's hard to give a specific direct answer to that. But I think that a clue perhaps can come from the nature of the act. So for example, if you commonly see people who are always barefoot in their act of it, and they've only worn their slop shoes over to, they make the grand entrance with the cape and the clogs, and then they drop everything and ascend to the sky. If they're barefoot, or if they're wearing slippers and everybody else is wearing slippers, it's probably a publicity stunt. But if the nature of their act does not require a bare foot wrapped around an apparatus, they could potentially wear a heel for that. I can't imagine it myself, but I know that some did, but it is hard to prove without a video.
Thank you so much. And going back to your earlier point about the labor and costuming and who was in charge, we had a question from Kathleen, particularly in the earlier days. Was there always a costume mistress who made the costumes, who was responsible for their upkeep? And I'd imagine that would vary kind of from show to show, but can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yes, and I am wishing that I had included some of these images. There is an image, and I will link it in the doc that we put together, where we see backstage the wardrobe mistress figure working. It's a posed photo, but there is usually someone backstage in charge of costumes, because these at least have to be laundered. So the costumes for Ringling, according to an interview that I conducted with Chloe T, who's wonderful over at Feld, she said that up until about the year 2000, the acts would provide their own costume. It might be under the theme of the costume designer's look, but they may provide their own. That aside, wardrobe has been integral, I think, from day one. And it is a role that often fell to wives if husbands were employed in the show. And this is not just in circus, this is something that is kind of lingering in theater, in the role of wardrobe and pay equity. There's a whole conversation there, because wardrobe is typically paid much less. But clothes need to be maintained, they need to be laundered, they need to be cared for, they need to be altered. And if the performer can't do that themselves, then the show would have had somebody there to take care of it. And sometimes it was just one person and they were overwhelmed, and sometimes it's huge departments.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I have a few more questions in the chat, and then I see that Amelia's got her hand up too. So Bruce was asking, have you done any research on figure skating costume, and is there any overlap between figure skating and circus?
I have not done a lot. I very briefly worked with a figure skating costume designer in my early 20s and learned an awful lot from her about fit to the body. It's similar to circus in that you have an athletic, artistic body that's moving in a dynamic way. And so in speaking of G-force, a figure skater is also going to experience G-force on the body in the rotation of their spins. So there's aerodynamics involved, similar to circus. It's a close fit to the body, also similar to circus. And I would say, I think that especially in women's figure skating costumes, there's some governance over silhouette, which is more strict than in circus costume. But the base functionality, I would say, is similar.
And I've got a couple more. We have a ton of questions for you. People are so excited by this topic. But I'm going to kind of combine a couple in the interest of time. So there's questions about audience perception of the more revealing costumes, especially earlier in circus history, and thoughts about that. And then a sort of related question about circus corsets. How was that possible to be an aerialist wearing a corset? So sort of the revealing and then the less revealing, maybe more constraining elements of what you've talked about today.
Great. I'll tackle the audience perception question first. Women in circus were wearing garments that you would not typically see on the streets for a long time. And it's a functional thing. And I think the exception is perhaps that poster where they're in the long red skirts. But it was a safety hazard. And so there are specific things that women in circus had to wear. And to the male gaze, which is a whole separate area of study and conversation, you have the male gaze of the male costume designer and you have the male gaze of the male viewer. And those may be aligned or they may be two separate things. So the male viewer may see it as a salacious thing and perhaps be more inclined, and women as well, because it was a novelty. And so they were seeing more parts of a woman's body than you would typically see, but done in an artistic way that was clearly athletic and functional. If we pivot to the corset question, I think if you, those of us who have worn corsets in the past, there are different lines of a corset, there are different silhouettes and lengths of a corset and different elements of support. So if you are doing tight lacing, you perhaps would not be able to do a whole lot up in the air unless you were relying mostly on flexion of the lower body and your corset hit at your natural waist. So that is to say, if you could be standing up straight wearing a corset and then be able to bend over and touch your toes because you're just bending at the waist and your corset is short enough, that would work. If the corset was longer, it would need to be cut in such a way that you had some movement below the natural waistline. I think an interesting difference, if you think about the torso of the circus performer, if you think about a contortionist, the range of motion that a contortionist can attain is largely centered around extension and flexion of the spine. If the spine is restricted by the wearing of a corset in any way, then clearly they're not going to be putting their feet up over their head unless the corset was made with stretch panels or was very loose or was really, really short. But the average fashion or daily wear corset off the street, I think, would not allow for a lot of circus movement.
Thank you so much. And Amelia, do you want to ask your question? You want to unmute? And
Jenny Leigh, that was awesome. Thank you. Hi, I have long been interested in the similarities between the costumes of sideshow performers, so specifically tattoo performers, which are really, really similar in the late 19th century to those of aerialists and other people wearing functional costumes. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think that there's a tie there with the aesthetic of the reveal of the circus body. In that, and I also will say that my work does not focus on sideshow in terms of, I do have to graduate at some point. So in terms of time and scope, I have to narrow my lane a little bit and give myself some parameters. But in terms of exposure of the circus body, if you were seeing circus women in the tent doing these extraordinary acrobatic acts, and you could see a lot of their skin, that aesthetic of, let's say, a corset with some straps, and maybe you have that little underarm panel, but most of your arm is revealed, and then you have bloomers. That aesthetic would carry over very naturally to the sideshow so that you could see more of the skin. And it would also be a similar silhouette that the audience would be kind of subconsciously comfortable with, maybe not consciously, but subconsciously more comfortable in that they had been previously exposed to it.
So I think we're a little bit past our time, so thank you for sticking with us. I've gotten a few more comments and questions in the chat. I'm wondering, Jenny Leigh, if you wouldn't mind maybe sharing your email address in the chat with everyone, because I think there are a lot of people who want to continue this conversation, have some really interesting comments to share. That seems to be our best bet at this juncture, but I'm also thinking we should probably bring you back for another talk and convene again at some point soon, because this was wonderful. And I want to thank you so much, and thank you, Jennifer, for bringing this about.
I'm delighted. Before everybody leaves, I want to plug that the series isn't over yet. We are at the midway point, right? We have 2 more speakers who will be coming up next week. We have Betsy Golden Kellum, who will be talking with us about Lavinia Warren, who is Mrs. Tom Thumb, and the birth of celebrity culture. And then Amelia, who is here with us, who is interested in tattooed ladies, will be joining us on May 20th to talk about just that subject and their stories. They will both be wonderful programs also. And in summary, Jenny Leigh, thank you, thank you, thank you. That was wonderful. I can't wait to see what you come up with next.
Thank you so much for having me. I think that the conversation about circus costume is important. It's nascent and it needs to continue. There are some resources out there, and I will develop a document to get over to Jennifer. Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.